you can have so much functionality built into like a trackpad. It's pretty crazy.
Hey everybody, I'm Bo Moore with IGN. I am joined here with Pierre Liu and Steve from Valve. Thank you guys for joining me today. Could you guys go ahead and introduce yourselves and tell us what you're working on?
Sure, yeah. So I'm Pierre Liu and I work here on the platform side at Valve. So I've been, working on developing SteamOS and our various hardware initiatives over the years.
I'm Steve Cardinale. I'm a hardware engineer. I'm primarily a mechanical engineer. I've been working on this Steam controller, getting it from inception through mass production.
So to start off, we're obviously talking about Steam controller today. And one of the things I want to ask about is, so there's a lot of different factors that go into what you consider a pro controller or a high-end controller. From y'all's perspective, what do you consider are the essential features?
Yeah, I mean, for us, we want to provide as many advanced inputs as possible so people can just play the way they want to play their games. In particular, both gyro and trackpads are something we find really important for these advanced feature controllers. There really are a high skill ceiling input that you can use to get really high performance in competitive games, but also like when you're playing casual games like deck builders, they just give you another way to play that's really comfy.
A lot of comparable high-end PC controllers, they often cost in the neighborhood of upwards of $150, $200. So how were you able to get the price down to $99 despite all of the fancy tech that's worked into the Steam controller?
Yeah, a lot of it was discipline around what we include and don't include. We kind of had one of these guiding principles that we wanted it to have input parity with the Steam Deck for the most part. People are taking the Steam Deck and then playing their Steam Deck and then going to the controller. We want it to feel really familiar. That helped us keep things pretty even keel on like not throwing in a whole bunch of things that would add costs. But on top of that, there's a lot of thoughtful engineering and design that goes into it to make sure that we're delivering the best possible value at the price point we're delivering to give people just a lot of different opportunities.
You mentioned the trackpads. Do you have any data about the use of the trackpads? Like, I'm really curious if people are actually using them to play games a lot, or is it mostly for desktop navigation or something else?
Yeah, we end up getting quite a bit of feedback, but it's more indirect. In general, we don't collect a lot of data on what people do and don't do on Steam directly, but we try and stay tuned to all sources of feedback, right? We've seen the trackpads being used for a lot of game playing, camera controls for third person and first person games. Also, assigning radial menus and virtual menus on the left trackpad for playing games that are designed for mouse and keyboard with a lot of hotkeys, right? Like that's a pretty important use case for them. Obviously, getting through launchers, controlling your desktop is pretty important, but by and large, I think people are using it in game for those uses.
I just always wonder if anybody's actually trying to play something like Crusader Kings or an RTS or something that really needs fine mouse control.
Absolutely. Yeah. People have been playing those kinds of games. If you even before for the original Steam controller and then all the Steam input layer with normal controllers, then Steam Deck and now the new Steam controller, you see a lot of community configurations from folks that have created their own way of playing those games, right? But definitely the controllers, like the deck controller and the new Steam controller to have a trackpad, have been really good experiences to be able to take those games that are designed for mouse keyboard and play them in other rooms of the house. I think we've seen good success from that.
So, speaking of the other rooms, can you guys give me an update on Steam Machine and Steam Frame? Is there an updated timeline?
Yeah, we don't have exact details about the timeline to share today, and we're hard at work on trying to get them out the door. I think we are definitely expecting to roll out some news soon about that. But in general, I think things is going well. The Steam controller definitely is a building block for something like the Steam Machine, right? The experience of the Steam Machine is gonna, especially for things like Steam Machine Verified and the out of box process. Definitely is a more seamless experience with the Steam controller, but we definitely expect that the controller is also a product that stands on its own. That's going to have many users that are just normal like PC desktop users, where it'll be a good additive option for them.
So obviously, Steam controller is built for PC or machines running Steam. Was there ever a consideration for trying to get console support for, say, Xbox or PS5 or even just Switch? getting those to work. I mean, a lot of those systems, they just support Bluetooth. And so, the Steam controller has Bluetooth, obviously, but I tried connecting it and it unsurprisingly did not work. So I'm curious if you'll ever had that as a consideration, or if it's something that you would consider on like a V2 or something like that.
Yeah, that was not really a goal for us because those controllers, or at least those platforms, that they have a pretty fixed expectation of what they consider to be a controller, right? Like if you're an Xbox or a PlayStation licensed controller, you have a very specific set of controls and a very specific API that you're using to communicate with games. And because we have those extra features, those APIs in a sense don't really let you express the full potential of the Steam controller. And so for us, yeah, it's very much intended to be paired with Steam or other client applications that talk to Steam, like Remote Play on your mobile devices or from a thin client, smart TV, those kinds of things. If you don't have a full PC running Steam. That being said, we have done a lot of work to make sure that you can add any third-party app that you're using outside of Steam to Steam, so that you can benefit from that whole layer of configuration. So that you can just add your games to Steam and still use the controller to its full potential. On platforms where Steam's not running, like you mentioned, some consoles and other types of PCs and non-PC devices, we have a baseline level of functionality where the controller acts as a kind of a mouse and keyboard, right? So you can use that to get through your BIOS screens or like get through whatever you need. But at the end of the day, the core experience is intended for using with Steam.
So tell me what's happening with Steam Deck. I've noticed that it's been out of stock for a good bit. Can we expect that more stock on Steam Deck is coming back, and on what time frame?
Yeah, we don't really have any specific details to share about that, but it's something we're working hard on. And as you're aware, there's a lot of considerations right now with respect to shipping being difficult, and also memory shortages and all that. So we've been trying to work through that because we are very cognizant, of the fact that there's folks that want to get Steam Deck and they're not currently able to get it. It's available in some regions right now, but in general, it's something that we're working very hard on.
You mentioned the RAM shortage. What steps is Valve taking to mitigate costs as we're dealing with this RAM shortage for both Steam Deck, forthcoming Steam Machine, and other places where it affects your hardware?
We're trying to make sure to keep options open and to work with as many different manufacturers as we can, right? I think in general, that's something that we're doing throughout our hardware design and production phase, where we're always cognizant of the fact that having a single source for a given part would put us downstream of potential shortages and things like that, in a way that affects the continuity of the supply and the price for end users. So from the get-go, we've been trying to make sure that we have many options there, and that's been proving really useful in this kind of climate, because we can work with all the big players and some of the smaller ones as well. That being said, the conditions around memory are pretty global right now. There's only so much that we can do. But for example, there was a similar condition during the COVID times, where there's a microcontroller shortage, right? And people couldn't really build anything that had small chips. So every sector from automotive to consumer PCs was affected by that, right? And because we had so many different options open in terms of putting different types of microcontrollers in there, we were able to navigate that and keep some supply in a climate where maybe some other players were not able to do that. So we expect to be navigating the memory thing the same way.
It sounded originally like the Steam controller and Steam Machine and potentially even Frame were all planned to launch at the same time, and now we have the controller coming out before the others. Is the delay for the Steam Machine, is it solely due to the RAM shortage, and is it basically just a price thing, or is there another factor, like is it just not ready yet, that is keeping it from hitting the market?
In terms of details about what's going on with machine, that's not quite what we're trying to talk about today. But in general, I would say that there's not kind of an arbitrary consideration about tying product launches together or anything like that. For us, the controller is something that stands on its own, and we want to make sure that we can get that to customers in parallel to anything that might be happening with Steam Machine, right? I think doing it in the other order would have been harder, right? Like the machine is harder to ship out without a controller, but the controller is definitely something that we think is going to be primarily used by an audience on normal desktop PC and folks that it's going to be great for Steam Machine, Steam Deck, and all these other things. But at the end of the day, I think the folks that are going to just be getting it to use on their PC are going to be the primary audience for it. And so we want to make sure that we can get it into their hands as soon as possible, as soon as it's ready, basically, without having to wait for any other factors there. But in terms of Steam Machine and stuff, yeah, well, it's really just about the logistics of getting it into users' hands. I think if you've used a Steam Deck docked, the experience is pretty much there, right? It's that plus some more GPU horsepower. Of course, there's a ton of polish and other feature work that we can do, but at the end of the day, the core experience is there. And the key thing that is making it not launched yet is really just about the logistics of finishing it up in terms of supply and getting it to users' hands.
I'd love to hear what are the sort of wildest or coolest usages of the touchpad that you've seen, most creative implementations that people have come up with.
Yeah, we'll probably both have an answer for that because we've seen a ton of different things. But I mean, in general, I think folks that are able to play games with many different hotkeys, right, is always pretty impressive. Like what you can do with nested menus and modifier keys, right, to have a game that has like 30 hotkeys still fully playable with the controller. Speaking anecdotally, I have a kid that plays a lot of Factorio, and seeing what he can do with the trackpad on the Steam Deck is pretty impressive to me. But I don't know, Steve, have you seen or experienced any wild uses there?
One of the things that we've been working on is like a how-to guide for using Steam Input Configurator as well as the trackpads. And in that process, me and my desk neighbor, we were like trying to see all the stuff that we can hook up. And like just the fact that you can make a radial menu on your trackpad with 20 inputs and then action set that so that in different contexts it does different things. It's like, to PL's point, you can have so much functionality built into like a trackpad. It's pretty crazy. That being said, one of my favorite uses of it, which is really not putting it through spaces, is I use the right trackpad as mouse and the left trackpad as mouse click left and right. I split it as a D-pad down the middle. And like you can play pretty much any casual deck builder game that's meant for just like, clicking and dragging a mouse so comfortably just by doing that simple input. And that's kind of the opposite of your question there, but it's another really interesting use that we found when we were just kind of messing around in the early days.
Yeah, I appreciate that it has all of these really advanced use cases that can be unlocked if you want to, but you're not sacrificing the experience to get there, and it just works well out of the box. That's what I found
for sure.
using it.
For us, that was one of the core goals of the new Steam controller, right? Is to be a traditional controller first and foremost that has all the inputs that you need to play all the games that are designed for controller in the places that your fingers will expect them, right? So it's all that you need from a normal controller, and then all those advanced inputs that can be used to play basically the whole catalog are there if you need them, but they're not in the way.
Well, last thing, because I have to ask, what can you tell me about Steam Deck 2?
We're hard at work on it, and obviously every step of the way, like if you look at our hardware projects over the years, there's always you can draw a straight line from original Steam controller and Steam machines to Steam Deck to everything that we're announcing and shipping this year, right? And we expect Steam Deck 2 will be a lot of the same, where a lot of what we're doing here will be learnings that build up to it.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for your time, guys, and the information. And stay tuned for our review of the Steam controller on IGN.com. And for everything else, keep it right here.